I never imagined myself working at a mortuary. It was the kind of place I had always been wary of, ever since I was a kid. The very idea of being surrounded by bodies, lying there motionless yet with an uncanny sense of presence, always sent a chill through me. But life has a funny way of pushing you into corners you never expected. And so, here I am, walking into my first night shift at Ashford Mortuary, a place as old and creaky as the town it belongs to. Ashford is the kind of town that time forgot. A small, windswept place on the outskirts of nowhere, where the streets empty out by dusk, and the only sounds at night come from the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional lonely train whistle. The morgue itself sits at the edge of town, past rows of dilapidated houses and a cemetery that stretches out like a black sea under the moonlight. The building is old, built in the 1930s, with flaking gray paint, heavy oak doors, and a brass sign that reads Ashford Mortuary in letters that have long lost their shine. I got the job almost by accident. Fresh out of college, having studied forensic science with the vague idea that I'd end up in some bustling city lab, I found myself back in Ashford, taking care of my ailing mother. When she passed away, there wasn't much keeping me here, but neither was there a reason to leave. The town's only funeral home was looking for help, and the mortician, Mr. Everly, seemed grateful to have someone take the night shifts, which he himself was getting too old to handle. Mr. Everly was a kind but tired man, with a slight stoop and eyes that held too many memories. He showed me around on my first day, explaining how everything worked, how to handle the paperwork, the autopsy tools, the cold storage units. But he was clear about one thing. The night shift is different, he said with a lingering glance toward the dimly lit hallways. You'll be alone, but, well, just keep to your routine and don't wander off too far. I brushed off his words as the quirks of an old man, but as he handed me the keys to the building, there was a moment where his hand lingered on mine, a look in his eyes that I couldn't quite place, something between pity and caution. And then he left, with a quiet nod. The first hour of my shift was quiet. I filled out paperwork, familiarized myself with the procedures, and listened to the hum of the cooling units. It felt like a peaceful place, oddly calming, considering the nature of the work. It was around midnight when I first heard it, the quiet creak of the main door, followed by slow shuffling footsteps coming down the hallway. I turned around, expecting to see one of the medical examiners who occasionally came by to finish reports. Instead, an elderly man stood at the entrance of the autopsy room. He wore a gray suit that had seen better days, the kind that looked like it came straight out of an old photograph. His hair was a thin, silvery white, slicked back in a style that had long since gone out of fashion. Despite his age, his posture was ramrod straight, hands clasped behind his back as he peered into the room. "You must be the new assistant," he said, his voice carrying a faint rasp, like the sound of dry leaves underfoot. "Name's Samuel." I nodded, trying to hide my surprise. "I'm Alex." I didn't think anyone else would be around at this hour. He gave me a tight-lipped smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I've been around these halls longer than you'd think. Figured I'd give you some pointers. Night shifts can get..." I shrugged off the strangeness of it all. Maybe he was just another old-timer who'd worked here back in the day, unable to let go. He offered me advice on handling the bodies, speaking in vague, roundabout ways. But one thing he said stuck with me. "You want a lot to lock that third storage unit 3 times, every time. Trust me on that, lad. Keeps things where they ought to be." His eyes, pale and unblinking, seemed to linger on the cold storage unit, as if it held some unspoken history. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, but something about his tone made me pause. "All right, I'll keep that in mind," I said, humoring him. He nodded, satisfied, and shuffled back into the shadows of the hallway, his footsteps fading like a sigh in the dark. Several minutes later, I found myself standing in front of that very cold storage unit. Number 3. I remembered Samuel's words, and with a shrug, I decided to follow his advice. One turn of the key, then another, then a third. The lock clicked each time, sounding unusually loud in the silence. And that's when I heard it. It started as a faint scratching, like nails dragging across metal. I pressed my ear against the door, thinking it might be the cooling mechanism acting up. But the sound grew louder, turning into muffled whispers, then moans that vibrated through the metal. My chest tightened with a sense of unease. I took a step back, but then I saw fingers pressing against the frosted glass from inside, their outlines distorted but unmistakably human. They clawed at the door, leaving smudged streaks across the glass. I froze. The sound swelled to a frantic banging, like someone was desperate to get out. I fumbled for the key, my mind racing with possibilities, rational explanations that suddenly seemed hollow in the face of those frantic fingers. But just as I was about to unlock the door, I remembered Samuel's warning and stepped back. The banging stopped. Silence fell over the room, thick and suffocating. I waited for a few seconds, then forced myself to look through the glass again. The fingers were gone, leaving only a faint fog on the window. When I finally mustered the courage to unlock the door and open it, the body inside lay in its original position, lifeless still, but its head turned to face me, eyes wide open. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. But before I could process what I was seeing, Samuel reappeared, his face twisted into an expression that I could almost describe as proud. "You did well," he said softly. "You kept it under control. You followed my advice." I wanted to question him, to demand an explanation, but the words lodged in my throat like shards of ice. Samuel patted my shoulder in an almost fatherly gesture, then turned and vanished into the dim hallway, leaving me alone with the corpse. My hands were shaking as I closed the unit again, triple-checking the lock before stepping away. Later, when the adrenaline had worn off, I decided to check the security footage. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, on the grainy screen, I watched myself standing motionless in front of the storage unit for over an hour, my face blank and expressionless. And Samuel? He was nowhere to be seen. I tried to shake off the unease as I finished my shift, but the memory of that footage lingered in my mind like a stain that wouldn't wash out. It didn't make sense. How could I have stood there for an hour when I could have sworn it was only a few minutes? And what about the old man? He had been right there, but the camera showed nothing. Just me, frozen, staring into that damn storage unit like I was in a trance. As the first rays of dawn crept through the high, narrow windows of the morgue, I left the building, my thoughts in turmoil. Mr. Everly was just parking his car, but I didn't stick around to chat. I just waved at him and said, "I'm out, need to get home." "Rough night," he replied. "Yeah, something like that." The following evening I tried to convince myself it had all been my imagination, some trick of the mind caused by fatigue. But deep down I knew there was something more to this place, something far more unsettling than the quiet loneliness of working with the dead. And worst of all, I had the creeping sensation that Samuel would be back. When I returned for my next shift that night, the air felt heavier. I did my rounds as usual, checking the cold storage units and autopsy room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed a little too deep, every creak of the old pipes a whisper I couldn't quite catch. By midnight I found myself in the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face, trying to clear the cobwebs from my mind. As I reached for the paper towels, I glanced up at the mirror, and that's when my heart lurched into my throat. My reflection wasn't there. The sink, the tiles, the dull light overhead. Everything else was mirrored perfectly, but where I should have been standing, there was only empty space. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, thinking it had to be a trick of my mind. But when I looked again, I saw him, Samuel, standing in the doorway behind me, his mouth moving silently as if he was speaking. I spun around, but the doorway was empty, the door half open, swinging gently on its hinges. When I turned back to the mirror, it remained dark, blank. A chill crawled down my spine, like icy fingers trailing along my skin. For a moment I thought I saw other faces in the glass, pale, expressionless, their eyes hollow and staring. Then the lights flickered, and in that brief flash they vanished. I staggered back, nearly tripping over my own feet, and reached for the door. But as soon as my fingers touched the handle, it slammed shut with a force that sent a shudder through the walls. I yanked on it, but it wouldn't budge, as if something on the other side was holding it closed. My pulse thundered in my ears, and my hands began to sweat as I pounded on the door, shouting for help that I knew wouldn't come. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing stale and cold. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open. I stumbled out, gasping for breath, and in the dim hallway light, I saw scratches on the inside of the door, deep grooves etched into the wood, as if someone had clawed desperately to get out. Samuel's voice, low and calm, drifted through the darkness behind me. They don't like it when you look too closely at your own face here. It confuses them. I turned to face him, my anger barely masking the fear bubbling up inside me. What the hell is going on here, Samuel? What are they? He only offered me that same cryptic smile, a flicker of regret passing over his lined features. You'll understand eventually, but for now, you've got to keep your head down. You're still new. They're curious about you. He walked away before I could ask more, disappearing into the shadows once again, leaving me with more questions than answers. I glanced back at the bathroom door, the scratches glinting in the pale light, and a thought struck me that sent a shiver through my bones. Whoever had tried to get out of that room wasn't me. The next hour passed in a haze of unease. I moved from task to task mechanically, avoiding my own reflection wherever I could, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on me. Around 1 a.m, I was in the embalming room preparing the body of an elderly man for storage. It was a simple, repetitive task that didn't require much focus. But tonight, I couldn't stop glancing at the walls. There was a subtle, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing, that seemed to come from every direction at once. At first, I thought it was my own breath, ragged and uneven from nerves. But then I noticed the walls. They seemed to expand and contract, like the lungs of some unseen creature. I froze, my breath catching as the slow, labored breathing grew louder, filling the room with a chill that settled deep in my bones. I pressed my back against the metal slab, watching as the walls pulsed, as if trying to draw in air. Suddenly, Samuel appeared in the doorway, watching me with an expression that might have been pity. "They're remembering what it felt like to breathe," he murmured. His voice had a hollow echo, as if coming from some distant place. Been so long since they felt anything. I tried to edge toward the door, but when I reached for the handle, it refused to budge. The walls seemed to swell around me, the breathing filling my ears until it drowned out my own thoughts. Panic flared in my chest, but Samuel stepped closer, resting a cold, bony hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm, almost painfully so, and he whispered, "Breathe with them. They can't leave until they know you feel it too." Desperation clawed at me, but I had no choice. I forced myself to match the rhythm of the walls, inhaling deeply, then exhaling as the room seemed to press in around me. Each breath felt like it was being dragged from my lungs, and as the minutes crawled by, a heavy mist gathered in the corners of the room, thickening the air. Finally, after what felt like hours, the door swung open with a slow, agonizing creak. The breathing faded, leaving me alone in the cold, mist-filled room, my limbs trembling and my skin clammy with sweat. I turned to thank Samuel, but he was gone, leaving me with only the faint echo of his last words in the still air. After the encounter in the embalming room, the night seemed to stretch on endlessly. The air was thick with a sense of dread, and every small sound, drips of water from a leaky pipe, the groaning of old wood, made my skin prickle. The breathing walls had left me rattled, but I couldn't afford to dwell on it. There were still bodies to move, tasks to finish, and I had to keep going if I wanted to make it through the shift. Around 2 a.m, I went to the autopsy room to prepare another body for cold storage. The room was lit by a single overhead light, casting long shadows that seemed to flicker in the corners of my vision. I was halfway through lifting the body onto a gurney when I heard a faint, high-pitched sound that cut through the silence like a knife. I froze, straining my ears trying to place the noise. It was soft, almost like the wind at first, but it grew clearer with every passing second until I recognized it for what it was. Crying. The sound of a child crying. It echoed through the hallway, distant but unmistakable. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I set the gurney down, my hands trembling, and moved toward the door, peering into the dark corridor beyond. The sound continued, growing louder, more desperate. It was coming from somewhere down the hall, toward the cold storage units. I told myself it couldn't be real. But as I walked down the hallway, the crying grew clearer, turning into heart-wrenching sobs that twisted my insides. I reached the cold room where the sound seemed strongest and stepped inside. A body lay on the slab, but its face had changed. Tears streamed down its sunken cheeks, pooling on the metal table beneath it, and its eyes, those wide, lifeless eyes, were now open, staring straight at me. The crying came from its mouth, though it never moved, the sound pouring out in a thin, reedy wail that filled the room. I stumbled back, my heart slamming against my ribs, my mind struggling to make sense of the impossible sight before me. That's when Samuel appeared again, stepping out from behind a shadowy corner as if he'd been waiting there the whole time. "They don't all go quietly," he said, his voice low and even, as though he were discussing the weather. "Some of them hold on too tight. They forget what they are." I looked at him, trying to force the words out through my fear. What do I do?" Samuel's expression softened slightly, and he reached into his pocket, pulling out 2 tarnished silver coins. He walked over to the body with a calm, deliberate pace, and placed the coins over its eyes, murmuring something under his breath, words that sounded like a prayer, but in a language I didn't recognize. The moment the coins touched the corpse, the crying stopped. Its eyes slid shut, and its face went slack, returning to the stillness of death. He turned to me, his hand still resting gently on the body's forehead. "You'll need to learn this. It's not enough to be strong, lad. You've got to know the old ways. Keep the dead where they belong, or they'll start taking more than just your time." "What do you mean, taking more?" I asked, but Samuel only shook his head, slipping the coins back into his pocket as he walked past me. He paused at the doorway, glancing back over his shoulder, a shadow crossing his face. "Perform it wrong, and they might take more than just coins from you," he said softly. His words hung in the air long after he disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone with the body and the quiet drip of water in the distance. I didn't see Samuel for a while after that, but his warnings clung to my thoughts like a stain I couldn't wash out. I started carrying a few spare coins in my pocket, though I had no idea if they would help. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little less powerless. I moved through my duties on autopilot, my senses heightened to every shadow, every shift in the air. The building seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if something hidden in the walls was watching me, waiting for me to slip up. Sometime after 3 in the morning, the air grew unnaturally still, as if the entire building had fallen into a hushed silence. I was walking through the hallway outside the autopsy room when I heard footsteps. At first they were faint, like the soft padding of bare feet against tile. But they grew louder, echoing through the empty corridors, following me wherever I went. I spun around, expecting to see Samuel playing a cruel joke. But the hallway was empty, shadows pooling in the corners like thick ink. Footsteps continued, steady, relentless, matching my own as I walked faster, then broke into a run. It was as if someone was pacing just behind me, always a few steps out of sight. Panic surged through me, but as I ran, Samuel showed up, standing inches away from me, his pale eyes unblinking. I nearly collided with him, stopping myself just in time, my breath coming in short, frantic bursts. He placed a finger to his lips, the gesture slow and deliberate. "They like to pretend they're still alive," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "But you must not turn around, no matter how close they get. Acknowledge them, and they'll become too real." My mouth was dry, my tongue heavy as I tried to form a question, but before I could speak, Samuel stepped back, vanishing into the shadows once more. The footsteps, now just behind me, grew faster, their rhythm erratic, filled with an urgent energy that sent shivers down my spine. Cold breath brushed the back of my neck, and I could feel the weight of a presence pressing in, closer and closer. I forced myself to keep walking, fighting the urge to turn and face whatever was behind me. My heart pounded in my ears, my legs moving mechanically, each step an act of defiance against the growing fear. The footsteps seemed to surround me, closing in from every direction, but I kept my eyes forward, refusing to look back. Eventually, the footsteps began to fade, retreating into the distance until the only sound left was my own ragged breathing. I sagged against the wall, the tension draining from my body in a wave of exhaustion. I stayed there for a while, trying to catch my breath, until the building's silence settled around me like a shroud. The rest of the night dragged on with an oppressive weight, the minutes crawling by like hours. My mind kept replaying the strange encounters with Samuel, the chilling footsteps, the crying corpse, each event weaving itself deeper into the fabric of my thoughts. By now I had given up on finding rational explanations. Whatever was happening in this place was beyond logic, beyond the natural. Yet something inside me knew that I had to make it through the night. Dawn was my only hope, a promise of light that might chase away the shadows lurking in the morgue. It was nearing 4 a.m. when I heard the chime of a bell from the reception area, the faint, metallic ding that sent a shiver through my already frayed nerves. The morgue was locked, yet the sound echoed through the empty hallways, clear and insistent. I approached the waiting room cautiously, each step hesitant. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing the worn, threadbare chairs. There, in the far corner of the waiting room, sat an elderly woman with her face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. Her clothes were outdated, like she'd stepped out of a different time, the fabric faded and worn. She didn't react as I entered, sitting stiffly with her hands folded in her lap. I cleared my throat, trying to mask the unease that clawed at my gut. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but this place is closed. How did you get in?" My voice wavered slightly, the question sounding more like a plea. She lifted her head, revealing a pale, gaunt face lined with deep wrinkles. Her eyes, though shadowed by the brim of her hat, seemed empty, like wells that led into darkness. When she spoke, her voice was soft and brittle like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "I'm here for my son. He was supposed to be processed tonight." Her words lingered in the air, each syllable carrying a strange weight that made my skin crawl. I swallowed hard, trying to maintain my composure. I'm not sure what you mean. There's no record of any new arrivals tonight." She shook her head slowly, a tremor running through her frail form. No, you're mistaken. My son is here. I must see him before I go. Please." Her voice cracked on the last word, a note of desperation creeping into her tone that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I glanced down at the logbook on the reception counter, flipping through the entries, my hands unsteady. But there was no record of anyone matching her description, or anyone scheduled for processing that night. As I turned the pages, a chill ran through me. My own name stared back at me, written neatly in the margins with tonight's date and time, as if I'd been cataloged alongside the deceased. I looked up quickly, but the old woman was gone. In her place stood Samuel, his face drawn with an expression I could only describe as regret. "She comes when a new one is about to join us," he said quietly, his voice carrying an edge of sorrow. "You'll see her again when it's time." I stepped back, my pulse racing, trying to make sense of his words. "What do you mean, a new one?" "I'm not." The words died in my throat, replaced by a sudden awful realization. She thought I was. Samuel's gaze met mine, his eyes filled with a sadness that cut deeper than any of his cryptic warnings. "You've been marked, lad. You wouldn't be here otherwise. This place, it calls to those who have one foot on either side. It's no accident you took this job." A wave of nausea rolled through me, and I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself. My mind reeled with the implications, but before I could question him further, he turned away, fading into the shadows of the hallway, leaving me alone with the chill that seeped through the room. The events of the night had left me shaken to my core. I stood there, staring at my reflection in a small, dusty mirror. My face looked haggard, older somehow, as if I'd aged years in a single day. I tried to imagine what the rest of my life would look like if I stayed here, staring into shadows, listening to the whispers of the dead. But just as the thought crossed my mind, I heard a soft sigh, like the exhalation of breath behind me. I turned slowly, expecting to see Samuel again, but there was nothing, only the dark, empty hallway stretching out behind me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew with a sudden, bone-deep certainty that my time was running out. Just a few minutes later, I found myself standing once more in front of cold storage unit number 3. The metal door gleamed in the dim light, its frost-rimmed window obscured by a thin layer of condensation. I reached for the key, my fingers numb and shaking. I turned the lock once, twice, and then a third time, the clicks echoing through the silence. But as I pulled my hand away, I heard a faint murmur, a low voice that seemed to come from within the locker, whispering my name. Alex. My breath hitched. The voice was familiar but distorted, like a memory being dragged through water. Against my better judgment, I leaned closer to the glass, peering into the dark recesses of the storage unit. For a moment, I thought I saw my own reflection staring back at me, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes. But then it moved, lips curling into a smile that wasn't mine. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my ears. Before I could catch my breath, Samuel appeared beside me, his presence as sudden and unnerving as ever. He looked at me with an intensity that I hadn't seen before, his expression grim and unyielding. "You're running out of time," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "The building, the dead, they're all waking up to you, lad. You don't accept it, you'll never leave this place." "Not truly." I shook my head, backing away from him, trying to put distance between us. "I never asked for this. I just wanted a job, a way to move on." Samuel's face softened, but there was no pity in his eyes, only a weary resignation. "The dead need a guide, and the living don't come here unless they're already halfway gone. You were chosen same as I was." "No," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "I'm not like you." He stepped closer, his silhouette looming against the dull glow of the hallway lights. "You'll have to face them then. All of them." His words settled into my mind like a poison. He reached out a hand, as if to offer some final comfort. But I recoiled, the anger bubbling up inside me. I turned away from him, my thoughts racing. If he was right, if I truly couldn't leave until I confronted whatever spirits haunted this place, then I'd do it. But not on his terms. Not as another ghost waiting in the shadows. The next few minutes passed in a blur of frantic preparation. I gathered the silver coins Samuel had shown me, lining my pockets with them. I carried the logbook with my name scrawled inside it, hoping that it might hold some clue to undoing whatever bond had been placed on me. The plan was simple, desperate. I'd confront whatever lingered in the morgue shadows, whatever spirits or echoes of the past haunted the halls. I'd make them see me, understand that I didn't belong here. The footsteps returned, this time louder, faster, as if something was pacing around me, circling closer with every second. I felt a cold hand brush the back of my neck, and I forced myself to keep walking, my back to the unseen presence, knowing that if I turned around, it would be over. "You don't belong here," I shouted into the darkness, my voice cracking with desperation. "You're dead. All of you are dead." A woman's face appeared in the shadows, her eyes wide and empty, her mouth twisted into a silent scream. She reached for me with claw-like fingers, but I tossed a coin into the darkness between us. Her figure wavered, then dissolved into a mist that dissipated into the air, leaving behind a bitter, acrid smell. More of them came, faces twisted with rage or sorrow, hands reaching from the dark corners of the morgue, their whispers like a tidal wave in my ears. With every passing moment, I felt myself growing weaker, as if the building itself was draining the life from my veins. I stumbled into the waiting room, the final silver coin clutched in my hand, my vision blurring with exhaustion. And there she was again, the old woman in the wide-brimmed hat, sitting calmly in her chair as if she had been waiting for me all along. Her eyes glinted in the half-light, and when she spoke, her voice was like the crackle of dried leaves. "You've done well, child, but you can't cheat the shadows forever." Her words cut through me, and I fell to my knees, the last of my strength slipping away. I reached for the ledger in my pocket, but it felt like dead weight, dragging me down into the darkness. She stood and stepped closer, her features sharpening into a mask of sorrow and pity. "Do you see now?" she whispered, bending down until her face was inches from mine. "You were always meant to stay." The woman reached out and gently touched my cheek, her hand cold as winter's breath. I clutched the silver coin and pressed it against her hand. She recoiled with a hiss, her face twisting into a mask of rage, and for a moment I thought she would tear me apart. But then her figure began to fade, unraveling into threads of shadow that dissolved into the air. Her whispers lingered, slipping away into the dark, leaving me kneeling on the cold tiled floor, my heart pounding in the silence. I don't remember how long I stayed there, slumped against the reception counter. But as I rose to my feet, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the glass doors. My face looked older, lined with exhaustion and something deeper, a weariness that mirrored the look I had seen in Samuel's eyes. It was around 5 in the morning when I decided to search the archives in the basement. Old records, paperwork, anything that might shed light on how this strange cycle had begun. The basement was a labyrinth of narrow shelves, stacked with yellowed files and dusty ledgers, the air thick with the smell of mold and decay. As I sorted through the piles, a sense of urgency pressed against my chest, as if time was slipping away faster than I could grasp. I found a box marked Ashford History and opened it, my fingers brushing against brittle newspaper clippings and photographs that crumbled at the edges. One photo caught my eye, a black and white image of the morgue from decades ago. There, in front of the building, stood a younger Samuel, his face stern and expressionless as he posed beside a group of somber-looking men. But the most unnerving detail was the figure standing in the doorway behind them, its features blurred, but somehow familiar. The longer I stared at the photograph, the more I realized that the figure in the background bore a striking resemblance to me. My hands shook as I set the photo down, my breath quickening in the confined space. It didn't make sense, none of this did, but the implications churned in my mind like a sickness. Was I just another link in a chain that had been repeating itself for generations? And if so, was there ever truly a way out? As I rifled through more documents, I came across a journal, its leather cover cracked and stained. The words scrawled in hurried, desperate lines that seemed to grow more frenzied with each page. They see me. They follow me in the dark. I can hear them whispering my name. I am becoming part of this place, as they did before me. But there must be a way to sever the ties, to give them peace without binding myself to their fate. Perhaps if I face them, confront what lies beyond the veil. But the price may be too great. Ye tries. The final entry was smudged, the ink smeared as if by a trembling hand. If you are reading this, then you are the next. Know that you have a choice, but choices are never without cost. Find the ledger, and you will find your answer. I stared at the words, a sense of grim determination settling over me. I made my way back to the cold storage, clutching the journal in one hand, the silver coin in the other. The building felt more alive than ever, the air thick with whispers that brushed against my skin like cold breath. The shadows seemed to shift around me, moving with a will of their own, guiding me toward the third unit where the ledger lay open on the counter. As I approached, the temperature dropped sharply, frost creeping across the glass of the storage doors. The whispers swelled, growing louder until they formed words that clawed at the edges of my mind. Stay with us. You belong here. Join us. I ignored the voices, focusing on the ledger, flipping through its pages, until I found the entry with my name. The ink glistened as if freshly written, and beside it, I saw a small empty space, just large enough for a signature. Samuel's words came back to me. You have a choice, but choices are never without cost. My hand hovered over the ledger, the pen trembling between my fingers. I could sign it, accept my place, become its caretaker like Samuel before me. Or I could do what he had been too afraid to do. Confront the restless spirits, force them to move on, and risk whatever consequences came with it. I took a deep breath, steeling myself against the fear that gnawed at my insides, and turned away from the ledger. I'm not signing it, I said, my voice echoing through the empty halls. For a moment, there was only silence, a stillness so profound that it seemed as if time itself had paused. But then the building shuddered, a low, rumbling groan that vibrated through the floors, the walls, the very air. The shadows coalesced, taking shape in the darkness, forming faces, twisted, mournful, filled with a yearning that clawed at my mind. They surged toward me, hands reaching out, eyes wide with an emptiness that threatened to swallow me whole. I forced myself to meet their gaze, to hold on to the last shreds of defiance that kept me anchored to reality. And then I spoke the words from the journal, the incantation that bound the dead, but with a twist, changing the final line to one of release instead of containment. "Be at peace," I whispered, my voice breaking, my breath turning to mist in the frigid air. "This place is not for you anymore. Go beyond, leave me behind." The words felt strange on my tongue, almost as if they didn't belong to me. The groaning of the building deepened, turning into a rumble that shook the walls, sending dust raining down from the rafters. The faces began to blur, their outlines fraying and distorting, until they were no more than dark shapes caught in a current I couldn't see. The shadows dissolved, retreating into the corners of the room, fading into the cracks between the walls, until all that was left was silence. A silence so deep it felt like the entire world had paused. I opened my eyes, my vision blurred with tears I hadn't realized I'd shed, and looked around. I stumbled forward, leaning heavily on the counter as I caught my breath, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. My fingers brushed against the ledger, and I looked down at the page where my name was written. The ink had faded, the letters smudged as if washed away by some unseen hand. I stared at it, a wave of relief washing over me. I had done it. I had broken the cycle. The spirits had moved on, finally released from whatever held them here. I spent the next few minutes walking the halls, searching for any lingering signs of the entities that had once haunted the morgue. But the building felt different now, emptier, quieter, like a long-neglected house, finally rid of its ghosts. When the first light of dawn spilled through the windows, casting golden beams across the tiled floors, I felt a flicker of hope in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. As I gathered my things to leave, I found myself drawn back to the waiting room, where the morning sun had chased away the shadows. I stood in front of the glass door, the same one that had shown me only darkness, and forced myself to look at my reflection. It was me, older, more worn, but undeniably me. The lines of exhaustion were still etched into my face, but there was a clarity in my eyes that I hadn't seen before. I raised a hand to my cheek, half expecting to see something else staring back. But the glass only reflected the movement, as it should. I turned to leave, but as I took a step closer to the front door, I hesitated, glancing back over my shoulder one last time. The silence of the building seemed to press in around me, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure standing in the farthest corner of the hallway, his silhouette outlined in the morning light. Samuel. He stood there watching me with a faint smile on his lips, a look of something that might have been approval in his pale eyes. He raised a hand in a gesture that seemed almost like a farewell, and I blinked, expecting him to fade back into the shadows. But instead he simply disappeared, dissolving into a slant of light that cut across the hallway. A shiver ran through me, but I forced myself to turn away, to focus on the door in front of me. I pushed against it, the hinges creaking as it swung open. Fresh air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of pine and wet earth, the world beyond the morgue alive and vibrant with the morning. I stepped outside, blinking against the sudden brightness, and felt the sun warm my face. The trees that surrounded the building swayed gently in the wind, their leaves whispering a soft, soothing song that seemed to echo the peace I had found inside. I walked to my car, my legs unsteady but my mind clearer than it had been in days. As I got into the driver's seat and turned the ignition, I allowed myself a final glance at the old brick building, its shadow long and dark against the morning light. Part of me wondered if I would ever return, if the pull of that place would draw me back, now that I knew its secrets. But for now, I knew that I had earned my freedom, however temporary it might be. I drove away from Ashford Mortuary, the road winding through the trees, carrying me away from the shadows that had nearly swallowed me whole. And though I knew that the scars of that place would linger inside me, I also knew that I had faced the darkness and survived. As I rounded the bend, the morgue disappeared from my rearview mirror, swallowed by the forest, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to move on. Quiet lingered in my thoughts, a reminder of the things that had been left unsaid, the faces that still haunted my dreams. I thought of Samuel, his eyes filled with that strange, sad wisdom, and wondered if he had found peace in the end, or if he still lingered somewhere between the walls, watching over the place he had once called home. And as I drove into the rising sun, a single thought whispered through my mind, like a breath, like a shadow, like the faintest echo of a voice. Your shift is over when you've made peace with it.